Welcome to Sponge Heresy, the series where I attempt to paint all 18 Horus Heresy Legions without losing my mind and as quickly and efficiently as possible so you can get your armies on the battlefield for the War Master or for the Emperor, depending on your choice. Today we are tackling the smelliest of all of the traitor legions, the Death Guard. And we are doing this with sponges. Okay, so the first thing that I did is I used a rattle can, I sprayed the entire model black, I then hit it with a zenithal highlight top down of a white rattle can. Now obviously you could do this with airbrush and you could take a little more time over this, you know, adjust your lighting where you want that from, but this is purely just to force shadow towards the bottom parts of the model, which is going to save you an awful lot of time later on. Now, moving on to the armour, and this is where the sponge comes into the play. The real star of the show. Now, this gives you that grimdark charm without having to really spend hours on each model. It gives you the texture, it gives you that battle damage, it gives you points of interest on the armour, it forces shadow if it's used correctly, and this is a quick and easy way of getting an army looking really effective and ready for the battlefield very, very quickly. To start with, I'm adding pre-damage, and I'm using Skrag Brown, and I'm sponging that over the model in areas that are going to pick up damage and are going to pick up wear and tear. Which has got that more orangey tint, which is going to look really effective for rust. It's going to allow the off-white bone colour of the Death Guard to cover far better because those colours do not cover amazingly well over black. So once we've got our rust tones and our damage tones down, we are going to start hitting this with a base coat of Wraithbone. It's like an off-white from Citadel. Obviously you can use whatever colour you want, it's just one that I had to hand and looks quite effective, and I start sponging that on. I am sponging this on lightly. It's watered down and I'm essentially using the sponge as a dry brush. I'm taking off an awful lot of the paint and I'm applying this over time. And be lighter with that coverage towards the bottom of the model, and that's again going to add more interest and more damage and more texture, and it's going to force more shadow as that dark base coat is going to really show through. After I've applied the Wraithbone, I've mixed that with Pallid with Wych Flesh, 50-50 mix, and then I've gone back over because the Death Guard, if you look at them, they're an off-white, they're not really a bone, and the Wraithbone is too much of kind of like a warm bone colour, so using that Pallid Wych Flesh knocks that out, makes it a little colder and is closer to that kind of off-white that the Death Guard have. Now, moving on, we are moving on to the details, the fun bits. The weapons, the trim, any specific Legion colours. Now, for the shoulder pads, I did brush paint these on just because of the cream bone armor. It was going to be a lot easier to brush paint the green on rather than sponge it on and then have to try and clean that green off of that armor without losing any of that texture and making it look weird. So I start with Waagh Flesh. I then mix in some Straken Green, as I didn't have a Death Guard's green to hand, but the Straken Green mix is about 50-50 mix, and I'm applying that to the tops of the shoulder pads and those areas that are going to pick up the most light. The bolter, I literally paint black, and then parts of it I paint in silver. I'm using the Gunmetal grey from Vallejo, but obviously you could use lead belcher or, you know, your metallic of your choice, and the black that I'm using is from the 2 thin coat range. And for the trim, I'm using Spartan Bronze from 2 thin coats as well. Now, this is where the enamels come out to play. Now, they're not scary. They are honestly talent in a bottle. There is so much you can do with this. Now, I'm using this essentially as a completely overarching, unifying wash and dirt effect. I'm using Ammo by Migs Dark Wash, and I'm literally applying this entirely over the model and then letting it dry. Once that's dry, using some Q-tips, I get them damp with some clean mineral spirits, and then on those raised areas I'm removing the majority of that dark wash, leaving it in the recesses, leaving it in the shadows, and bringing up those highlighted points. Now, obviously, you could take this far farther. You could play with more enamels, you could add some streaks, you could add rust effects, rust enamels. You know, the world is your oyster, especially when it comes to stuff like the Death Guard. However, I just wanted to do some quick easy runs, as I've mentioned before. Then I go back, and in certain areas where the pigment of the enamels have kind of darkened bits down a little bit too much, I've gone back in and I've applied some highlights. So I have used more of the Straken Green and applied that. I have used Pallid Wych Flesh, again on areas of the armour that are going to be most in the light. Added some highlights onto the metal parts on your bolt gun. And that is it, pretty much done. And then it comes to basing. What I'm using is by Krautcover, Scenics, and it is a Tale of Grimdark, and essentially it is dirt, gravel, and it's got little bits of bones and skulls in, which I thought was incredibly fitting for a Horus Heresy battlefield. And there you go. Death Guard ready to deploy on Istvan for no suspicious reasons whatsoever. And they are done. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, sub, drop your favourite Legion in the comments. And next up, we are going to look at the White Skulls. I will leave a link to the Feral Painters Black Legion video in the comments, and I mentioned it earlier, and the tool that I'm using for the sponge shipping. It's only a couple of quid on Amazon, you get like 3 or 4, so it's well worth it. Thank you very much for being here, and I will catch you on the next one. Peace!